Hi, all. Welcome to Building a Blog with Gatsby. So today we're going to be talking about what Gatsby is, how to build a blog with it, obviously, but then we're also going to talk a little bit about how the JavaScript ecosystem has evolved, making things and how it compares to other frameworks like NextJS. So let's start with what is Gatsby. So Gatsby is a framework that's built on top of React, Node, and GraphQL, kind of marries them together. It provides another build step to a React application. So, while you're generating your project, we'll touch on that a little bit later. That build step is then extensible with plugins, which allows you to do a lot of cool and powerful things, which we'll touch on later. And it allows you to build static site generator, SSG, and soon, and I say soon even though it's launched, so it's fairly infant, but SSR sites as well. But what is an SSG site, right? What is that? So to answer that, let's start at the beginning, right? What is an HTML website? I know this is going to seem really simple. I promise we will some of the more details start somewhere. So let's start here, right? So an HTML site works pretty simply. On the developer's machine, they work with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They then ship that to a server. That server then hosts to users' machine, so that when they request, that HTML, CSS, and JavaScript gets returned to the user, and then they're able to render the content in their browser, right? React kind of turns this on its head a little bit. So React code and an index.html file is shipped from the developer machine to the server, but the React code is what actually generates the HTML that the user sees in the end. So the user requests data, the server returns the React code, but then the React produces that HTML on the user's machine itself, right? So this is fine, but it does introduce some problems, right? You're losing out on some SEO, you're losing out on some performance impacts, right? Your server is no longer able to pre-fill data, right? So this is where something like static site rendering works, SSR. So instead, you'd use an SSR framework like NextJS or Gatsby. Then you would ship that to the server. The server can then produce the HTML given the React that it's shipped with. And then when the user makes a request from the server returns HTML that should work properly. I don't know why my camera is not quite working. Give me 1 second. I swear this wasn't happening just a moment ago. All right, I will turn off my video and we will keep going. So here we have when the user gets the HTML, this HTML is then pre-filled, right? So this pre-filled HTML allows us to do things like understand what is on the page from site crawlers. It allows us to render out the contents immediately to the user instead of having that intermediary step of having to generate the code on the user's machine, right? Now, we've seen what happens when React runs on the user's machine, and we've seen what happens when code runs on the server's machine. Now, you guessed it, we're going to run that HTML on the developer machine, right? So instead, we're going to have a compiler produce HTML given React, which usually runs on the user's machine. But instead, we're going to run it on the developer machine and pre-generate all the content, right? Which is what SSG stands for. It's static site generation. So static site generation is then shipping HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like before, to the server, which then loads on the user's machine once they make a request. But here's the problem. Well, it's less a problem, but this is exactly how we were doing things back in the HTML days, right? Why do we need React? We've added some steps here that feel a little needlessly complicated to some people, which is understandable. The answer is that once this hits the user's machine, it's fully interactive, right? Now, yes, of course, you can do this with normal HTML web applications, but the benefit is that you don't have to write a separate layer to be able to render contents dynamically once it hits the client's machine, right? So you can still have route guards, you can still have auth guards, but now you can handle things like rendering, conditional objects, you can do all sorts of things that it allows you to change your contents on the machine, right? So the benefit is that you get a write code that handles both the server generation or the static site generation, as well as the user's machine all in one, right? Taking a look at site generation, which is what it's called when the user's machine is running the JavaScript to run things conditionally. The developer machine will run things conditionally using HTML. The HTML, CSS, and JavaScript will then be shipped to the server. The server will send out HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to the user's machine. And once the user's machine has, it can then reinitialize React, and then everything that was interactive will be interactive once again. So this means that your site can work without turning on JavaScript, but then once you turn on JavaScript later, then there can be enhancements like popovers or, animations or something like that, right? This is kind of the best of both worlds, where you have the ability to have SEO and you have pre-filled data, but then you also have interactivity as well. So taking a look at some of the pros and cons, vanilla HTML allows you to build, it's very fast, right? Assuming you do things properly, there's nothing closer than kind of quote unquote bare metal, right? But then of course it's hard to scale, right? Like I don't know if anyone is still or has worked with jQuery or similar in the past. It's difficult to make large scale applications, right? It's tough. Meanwhile, client-side rendering like React, right? There's a framework there now, so it's easier to scale. It's a bit easier to engineer. I mean, that's subjective, but I'm going to go ahead and make that claim. But then the detriment there is that like the user's machine, it's slow to initialize, right? It takes a long time, and there's specific SEO concerns, which is not great, right? Server-side rendering, on the other hand, has much better SEO handling, and it's usable without client-side JavaScript again. It allows you to do query-based optimization. So for example, let's say you're loading a user's profile page, right? The benefit there is that the user's profile page can be pre-filled with data. You don't have to wait for the database to return something on the user's machine. You can query the database on the server and then send that data through the HTML down to the user, right? The detriment there is that it's much more difficult to deploy, right? So instead of having an HTML static file that you deploy, it becomes more like running a serverless instance or something like that, right? Well, it's silly to call a server. Anyways, I'm not going to get on that tangent. I'm sorry. But you need specific servers to be able to run things, right? And it's more development effort than client-side rendering like React. On top of that, Gatsby allows you to do compile time rendering, which is like static site generation. Static site generation is layout-based optimization. So instead of being able to return specific information about the user themselves, you return data that every user can access. So like marketing sites are similar. It has good SEO, but the benefit is that you can now use CDNs for hosting, right? Which means that you're geo-sparsing your servers, which means that you're going to get better ping times, better results all around, right? That means that we no longer have access to query data that is based on the user's input, and it is more development effort than client-side rendering, right? So let's do it. Now that we understand Gatsby a little bit more, or at least that we better understand React, SSR, and SSG, right? Remembering that Gatsby, what we're going to be talking about today, is leaning heavily on the SSG side of things, even though it can do SSR nowadays. Let's outline our goals, right? First, we want our blog to have Markdown support. We don't want to have to deal with our authors having to write things in multiple different languages or different, like shouldn't have to learn React, anything like that. Markdown, right? We want to support multiple authors. There's a lot of instances where it's very beneficial to be able to handle multiple authors. We want to be able to handle an author page, right? So the author's page should be able to provide us data about the author, right? We want to see what the author has written before. We want to see information about them, stuff like that, right? And then, of course, we should have good SEO, right? SEO is kind of king with blogs. So we should also have pagination. There's going to be a lot of results. I forgot how many bullet points was on this page. Pretend I didn't. Okay, I guess I was pretty close with the SEO. At any rate, So pagination is the last one, right? We're going to have a lot of different items on the page. Ideally, our blog grows and expands as we do, and we need to be able to support that, right? So let's do it. Let's live code. We'll start by generating some starter template that Gatsby provides out of the box with the CLI, and it'll be Gatsby new and then the name of the blog. And from there, for example, here, all I've done so far is I have ran Gatsby new blog, right? It gave me this. So gives us a README. It gives us some files such as source, components, images, pages, and templates, right? And we can go ahead and start the project by running yarn, well, npm run develop. We're going to wait for Gatsby to load up the development instance. And while it's doing so, we can take a look at what's happening. So here we have pages that provide an index page, right? So if you're familiar with index.html, here we have an index.js, right? It's providing a static image, which is going to automatically scale. So even though the original image is inside of images, and it is size 800 by 800, when we open up our developer tools, it should only be a width of 300 because Gatsby allows us to do really powerful modification of images and other assets. We're also going to be able to have different pages, right? So each one of these files is a different route in our application. And once we open it, we can see that. It's our index.js. So we're seeing that image that we were talking about before. If we take a look at that image in our developer tooling, we can see that indeed it is of width 300, right? So it's of width 300, height 300, which is really cool. And then we have each of these, and importantly, one of the define intro from DSG, right? Inside of DSG, we have a function, right? But you'll notice that function is not inside of pages. Instead, inside of Gatsby node, it is creating a page using the path. And then the reason why it's called DSG is that it's saying it's to defer. We're not going to quite touch on DSG, but I did want to touch on the fact that you can create a page programmatically. And then later we'll touch on how you can pass data into that page, right? So let's go ahead and start by removing some of the files that we are not going to be using today. So yes, while having an index.html file can be very beneficial to some, we need to be able to pass data into that index.js. So we're actually going to go ahead and get rid of that. We're going to go ahead and get rid of these images. And then we're going to get rid of all of our components except for SEO, which we will touch on later. What else? Let's also go ahead and get rid of, in our config, we have a path, a mention of that images. So each one of these, we were talking about the extensibility of Gatsby before using plugins. These are all the plugins that ship by default. And by default, it tries to look for the images in the images directory. So let's go ahead and get rid of this. Cool. So now we can start by adding a blog, right? So let's go ahead. Oh, I apologize. Let's talk about one more thing really quickly. One of the benefits that Gatsby has over other frameworks is that it allows you to take a look at what data is being stored in your application using GraphQL, right? So if you're familiar with GraphQL, it's kind of like REST, but on crack. It allows you to have graphing relationships and to be able to type strictly query them. Now, usually this is on a server. What is throwing an error? Oh, that's right. Here, you know what? Hang on. Let me go ahead and just fix this. It was a risky move to live code. That's why I did it. All right. Now if we rerun, we should be able to pull up a page called GraphQL, which will allow us to query the in Gatsby instance of GraphQL. So like I was saying before, GraphQL is usually ran on a backend. For example, our GraphQL is going to be part of our build process, right? So it's going to provide data from Gatsby to the rest of our pages. And what we can do is we can take a look at what this looks like, right? So here we'll have a query, and then inside of this query, we can say something along the lines of give me site parent, or like I can take a look at the build time. I can take a look at any information that Gatsby might have. Now, this is not particularly useful as it is, but one of the things that we can do is we can actually add on to these types, right? So for example, we can add a blog type or a markdown type. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add that markdown type so that we can start adding our blog posts. So let me go ahead and create a folder called posts. And then I'll create this post. And then inside of this post, I will create an index.markdown file, right? And then it's as simple as going into our config. We can add in a reference to this indicating, hey, go keep track of what is inside of this file system, Gatsby, right? And that'll name it blog internally. And then what we're saying is go process any markdown files that might be inside of any file system that we're tracking, right? And then the only thing that we need to do now is that we need to run npmi transformer remark. But of course, because this is a live demo, I've already done that. Now let's rerun develop, right? Remember that we haven't changed any type of like backend, like we haven't changed any of the UI. Instead, we've updated our config file, which should allow Gatsby to track our data a little bit better, right? So once this builds, we can then reload GraphQL. And now we have something called all markdown remark, right? So here we can query for our nodes. Inside of nodes, we can see the HTML for each of the pages, right? So even though we had markdown here, we can see the HTML that is being generated by remark, right? So here we have a heading, then we have paragraph, then we have a block quote, then we have another paragraph tag, right? It'll give us a word count, right? It'll handle all sorts of like default things. We can see information about like the table of contents, which would give us our headers, right? So some pretty basic stuff. So we have all that data. One of the things that we don't have is we don't really have a unique ID for this, right? Like if we look, there's ID, but ID is not really human readable, right? That's kind of a really long UUID. So ideally what we could do is we could have each folder be a unique ID that we can utilize in a URL in the future, right? So let's go ahead and do that. Inside of Gatsby node, this is the code that runs on build time, right? So this is like what tells you, hey, you need to change things, or like Gatsby, do this before export, right? So let's go ahead and add this bit of code, right? What this is saying is that when a node is created in GraphQL, we want to try to see if that node is a markdown node, right? If it is, then we should get the original file path, and then we should treat that file path, which is in this instance, this post, and that file path should be the slug, right? So here, we're going to go ahead and restart our build process because we modified Gatsby node. Usually if you modify anything inside of source, it'll automatically refresh outside of source, and you need to manually refresh, which is what this warning is actually telling you. And then once it builds, we should be able to refresh our GraphQL instance. And now we can query for our slug, right? So let's go ahead and get rid of the rest of this. That's getting a little messy. And here we can see our slug is this post, which is going to be really useful later when we're trying to query our data. So now that we have our data all set up and our website still looks pretty basic, let's actually fix it. Let's add some stuff to our website, right? So we can go ahead and start by changing our base path inside of Gatsby node, right? So, oh, I guess we already did, because originally it was set to like DSG or something like that. But then also let's change our component, right? So right now our component is inside of page templates, right? Let's go ahead and rename that to blog list. And let's actually add it into a JSX file. We're going to go ahead and rename this file. So we're going to do blog JSX. And then here we can change this code a little bit, right? So what we're saying is, given our list of posts, which we will be passing in shortly, render them that shows the excerpt, which is the first few hundred characters of the Markdown itself, and then give us our slug, so link to it, right? So now we need to update our Gatsby node to be able to render posts, because right now we're not passing anything, right? So let's go ahead and query for that data QL, right? So here we're passing in GraphQL, or at least Gatsby is passing in GraphQL to the create pages page. We can save this component page as a path, right? And then what we do is we return GraphQL. We call GraphQL with a GraphQL query, right? So that GraphQL query might look something like this. We're going to get our first 1,000 blog posts. We're going to get the nodes, and we're just going to get the slug and the excerpt of 160 characters, right? Then, once that is done, we can say if there were errors, and throw them. Otherwise, we're saying that all data is present, right? So we're going to grab all markdown remark.edges.map, right? So we're getting the nodes. And then finally, we can say create the page, which I don't think we've gotten up there, create the page with the post list component, which we've resolved up here, right? And then in context, we're going to pass that list of posts, right? So post is going to be grabbed from GraphQL, which is grabbing from our markdown list. And then it's going to up pass to this component. And then this component is going to render on the root path. Right? Let's go ahead and see that in action. Path is not defined, so let's go ahead and do that really quick. I'm realizing that I may need to move a little faster through the rest of these slides. Or, well, not slides, but steps. So we will run this, and then we will take a look at some other stuff. That's it. We're rendering that one block. Hooray! Amazing, fantastic, wonderful, right? But one of the problems with doing this is that, I mean, now we don't have the page itself. We just have the list, right? So let's go ahead and add the page itself. So inside of the page, what we can do is, let me go in here. Okay. So the other problem, so the problem is that we only have the blog list, right? We don't actually have the blog page itself. So let's go ahead and add that. inside of our blog page, we're going to create a component that sets the HTML. So before we talked about setting the Markdown, right? Getting the HTML from the Markdown. So we're going to be making a page query, which is just a static export. Gatsby will run that for us. That export will then give us the HTML file that we can render inside of React, right? And then in this query, we're going to be slug. That slug is then passed by a create page. So here we're again saying for every single page inside of our query, right? Go ahead and run create page with the slug as the path. And then we're going to get the component and pass the context. That context will then be passed to the GraphQL query automatically. And then that query data will then be passed to the component inside of data, right? So here we can run develop. That page route won't exist anymore. Ah, come on. There we go. All right. So here we can see our normal page. And then if I go to posts-this post, we can then see that the heading is rendered as an H1, that the quote is rendered as a quote, even though there's not very much styling right now. And then the paragraph is rendered as a paragraph, right? Which is exactly what we would expect from our Markdown, right? So we have our heading, our paragraph, and our quote, and they're rendered as such in our page, right? So this is great and all, but our post list doesn't actually help very much. Like it doesn't actually show us a title, it doesn't show us an author information, nothing like that, right? So let's go ahead and inside of this post, we're going to add some of that information, right? So these three little lines are what is called a front matter. Front matter allows you to store metadata about a blog post inside of the Markdown itself. It provides a date and a title that because we're providing them, but you can also have things like arrays, right? Which we may touch on later. So we can have all sorts of data. So now that we have our front matter, let's go ahead and inside of Gatsby node, because Remark already handles front matters just fine. And inside of here, we can say that we want to sort our blog posts, right? Because we're limiting them, but we also want to sort them by the date, right? So we make sure we get the newest blog post at the top. And then on top of the excerpt, we can also grab data from that front matter. Grab the title. Of our blog list, we can say instead of listing by the excerpt, we list by the title. And then finally, we probably want the title here as well, right? Here we can add a front matter. We can say something like us an H1 data dot, oh, sorry, down remark dot front title. Right? So again, we're querying from our GraphQL instance inside of Gatsby in order to provide the data here. Apologies, y'all. Okay. And now if we go to our blog page, titles are not working. There is a reason for that. Oh, that's because in our blog list, it's not just post.title, it's post.frontmatter. And here we should be able to see it refresh with the blog page, right? So now we see the title as we expect. Now if we go back to our post, this is post, we can see that we have our title as well as the HTML that we would expect Remark to parse, right? Cool. So now that we have that, let's start adding author support, right? So we have metadata about the blog post, but now let's actually add authors, right? So as I was talking about before, authors is going to be an array. Right? And I'm going to add my username. Typing is good, right? One of the problems, though, is that where's my name, right? With an authors page, you usually want to have a name of some kind. You want to have like maybe social media or websites listed as well, right? So this doesn't give us a lot of information, and it wouldn't make sense to copy and paste this over and over and over. So let's go ahead and update everything. So let me, and then I'll check out. Cool. So here, what we've done is we have our posts, but then we also have a JSON file that you can look up by ID, right? So given this ID of crutchcorn, it'll give us the rest of this data. And what we've done to configure is that inside of Gatsby, we are adding our Json transformer, right? We're looking up and telling Gatsby to track data. That JSON file is then handled by transformer JSON, which adds an authors JSON that we can look up in our GraphQL instance. And then this GraphQL instance we can bind to authors, right? So given the JSON ID, which is the ID field in our JSON, we can look up the authors, and then inside of our Gatsby node, we can add author's name to our lookup, right? So now, excuse me. Now, if we re-look up things, and it should build. Apologies, y'all. Waiting for this to like render. Link is not defined. Okay, that's fine. Luckily, that issue isn't very bad. Isn't very hard to solve. We're going to look inside of right. So here we can say that we can see that I wrote this post, very long, very in-depth, detailed, and then inside of our page list, we also see the list, the post, right? So it shows both the title and the author information, even though inside of our front matter, we simply have the username, and then we can consolidate our information just like we would on, right? So now that we have that data, we can also go in and create author pages. So something like this. So here our author page is inside of page templates like before, and it contains all the information about the author, the name, the social media, and then that's about it, right? Oh, and the post as well, because inside of Gatsby node, we're saying for each author, right? For each author, filter to only the post that the author has written, and then pass it down as author or as posts, just like we would before. Of course, there's also an issue with link somewhere right here. So now if I click, I can see only the blog posts that I have written, and it also shows my Twitter and website, right? I know it doesn't look amazing right now. I promise we will fix that shortly. And then we can add the image author, the author image. So it's as simple as adding a PNG file, right? Oh, lovely face, beautiful, fantastic. And then adding a relative path, and that is automatically handled. JSON will just magically make that work, basically. And then Gatsby node, sorry, not in Gatsby node, inside of our author page, we then look up the profile picture. There's a plugin called Gatsby Sharp. Gatsby plugin sharp and transformer sharp that'll automatically take an image and add in this child image sharp data. And then we get the Gatsby image data and pass it to Gatsby's image component. And once that is done, we can see that the author image is here, and it contains some and fixed width that you define in your GraphQL query. So you can have a single image that then dynamically generates other images without having to do so yourself. What's a blog without SEO? So let's go ahead and add that. So here inside of, say, our blog list, we have our SEO component. We can pass in our title and some other metadata. This will then set relative links in your header, which is then accessible at build time. So when you actually do your initial render, this isn't handled at JavaScript. It is handled like during the initial load. It'll let you pass your title and whatnot, right? And then that's as simple as using React Helmet. If you're familiar with React Helmet, that just kind of works out of the box. It's kind of hard to visually demonstrate SEO, so I'm just going to keep going on, but it works, and it works really well. And then we can also add pagination support, right? This pagination support looks something like inside of our Gatsby node, we have a set maximum list of articles, and then we simply just manually go through and create pages, right? So each page should only have at most 5 items, which is what this logic is doing. And then it turns an array, right? And then what we can say is go grab every single post, get how many pages we have, create a page for the first post page, and then create every single page afterwards, right? So here we're creating author pages, we're creating normal pages, stuff like that. And then inside of blog list, we simply have a homegrown, well, I say homegrown, even though it comes from a package, pagination component that includes the current page, how many items are in a page, and that's about it, right? So now, if we load that, I've added 6 blog posts, even though 5 is our maximum, right? So ideally what we should see is first post, second post, so on and so forth. And then on the second page, or so our latest post, so 6 posts down to second post, and then on we just post. Right, so that's exactly what we see, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. And then the next page just has 1. And then I seem to have some issues. I don't know why, but I promise it's not related. But the nice part is that that's it. Like that's basically the entirety of a website, right? Like that lets you do whatever you want functionality wise. However, that's an ugly page. So let's add some simple styling. Here we can just simply add some CSS, right? Keep in mind, I haven't changed very much in the JSX. I haven't changed anything inside of Gatsby node. I've simply added some icons. I've added some like styling, a few other small things. So now let's go ahead and rerun develop. And we can take a look at what that looks like now. I'm not an amazing designer, but this is based on a project that I have spent more time on that we do have some pretty good folks on. So for a demo, it's pretty good. All right. So now this is what our authors page looks like, right? This is what our post lists look like, right? So we have these little cards with a little pagination component that indicates what page you're currently on. And then you can see the blog post information that's nice and centered with a little bit of spacing on each side and a little bit more styling about those, right? So pretty straightforward, you know, there's not a ton to this, but it also works pretty good. So you can keep going and you can expand this website to something like this, which is my website, right? Which is Unicorn Utterances. So I write blog posts about like how to do programming concepts, right? And here we have series that you can click through and see different sections of. We have our authors page, we have search, we have filters, right? And like the filters have this nice little animation. So you can keep going. You can add on as much as you want to a Gatsby site. And it definitely scales, although it is worth mentioning that even though this scales, this is still a fairly small blog page in comparison to like a big company, right? So let's go back to our slides. And we've talked about, well, that's fine. We've talked about Gatsby, right? But one of the other things that you may have heard of is NextJS. Here we have a framework built on top of React and Node. It allows you to make static sites. It's super popular. It's maintained by a large developer tooling. And it may make you think like, why, like, is this just not Gatsby, right? Like, aren't these pretty, like, they're sounding pretty similar on paper. And the honest answer is that they are fairly similar. The difference is that Gatsby kind of has a more mature, well, Next.js has a more mature static site generation, right? They have better customization, they're extremely stable, but they don't have a plugin system. It's a little more difficult, it's a little more homegrown, right? Meanwhile, Gatsby has a super powerful plugin ecosystem, and it's huge and it's awesome, and they have pre-built themes and all sorts of really cool stuff, right? But there's a bit of vendor lock-in because they handle a lot of things for you. As a result, they tend to do fairly non-standard ways of doing things. They have slower build times, which usually are your own fault. Like I will admit to having slow build times on some of my projects because of things I've done. And there are occasional bugs that may prevent you from doing upgrades or similar, right? So what I was talking about with Next.js that allows you to do, that's more difficult for Markdown setup, is that while we were able to do this within 30 minutes, right? Markdown in Next.js, you have to go read from the file system. Inside the file system, you then have to manually run front matter. That front matter, then you have to manually go grab data, and then you have to manually parse it using remark. You have to manually add all your own remark components. And then inside of there, you have to handle things yourself, right? So Next.js is great for huge projects, especially those that are a full stack application when you need to scale and you need to scale big. But unfortunately, Next.js is also somewhat slow to build for at times, but it's also unopinionated and it's easy to migrate away from when needed. Gatsby, on the other hand, is more useful for like marketing sites, blogs, super useful for those. It allows rapid prototyping, and but it's fairly opinionated, which allows it to provide tools out of the box. So yeah, that's my talk for the day. So much for, there is a GitHub repo with this example code. I think I can post that in chat. Oh, that is the wrong blog. Hang on. Not CLI. So I will post the, there we go, the GitHub link. And then I also wrote a blog post about what SSR, SSG, and CSR are. So if there's any help there, there's that link as well. You can also find me on Twitter or GitHub at Crutchcorn. And then all my writing and such is crutchcorn.dev. So yeah. Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey. I am reading chat right now. So please feel free to ask me any questions. I know we only have about 5 minutes left. So any questions are highly encouraged and very welcome. So let me know if there's anything I can answer. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. On a simple level, what are the benefits of using SSG versus normal CF sites? So the advantage would be that it allows you to have easier deployment process, right? So for example, my blog Unicorn Utterances is hosted on a CDN, namely DigitalOcean Spaces, right? And the benefit is that if I send this link to someone in, say, India, right? They're on the other side of the globe as me, and yet it will load just as fast for them as it will for me, like more internet speeds, right? And the reason for that is because I'm able to deploy on multiple different continents all at the same time using CDNs, right? CDNs are huge to be able to get like cheap and effective servers that are geosparse, right? Meanwhile, if I only hosted this, say, with a CF site, I would then have to manually spin up an instance for every server, and every server is going to be very expensive, right? Like, you know, server costs are absolutely instrumental, right? And not just with Cold Fusion, but also with like NextJS, right? NextJS, if you're not doing, they do have a static site export, but if you're just using the server-side rendering, which is kind of what CF sites can do, then you're going to be ending up with a much larger server bill than if you just did static site generation and deployed using a CDN. So. Yeah. And let me take a drink real quick. And to be fair, that's the reason why it's so beneficial with stuff like marketing sites and blogs, right? Is that, you know, I want people from anywhere to be able to read this and to be able to hopefully learn from it. And, you know, like, that's the benefit, right? Is like marketing sites, they need to be quick and snappy. They need to load for everyone, but, you know, do you consider Gatsby your go-to as far as SSG is concerned? Do you use or recommend any others? What, in your view, primarily sets Gatsby apart? So I'm actually working on migrating one of my sites, namely Unicorn Utterances, to NextJS, right? And I will spoil the surprise in a minute. But the reason why I'm migrating my blog to NextJS is because I'm wanting to do really like literally manipulating the Markdown AST customization, right? And when you need to do that, I have really ran into issues with some of the bugs when I'm doing the super custom stuff. When you're doing basically anything that they want you to be doing, like super well documented, it works joyously. Like Gatsby is super, like, I mean, I think I spun up this entire website in maybe a couple of days at most, super fast, right? So I think for that type of project, for like simpler blogs or for, you know, like stuff like this, I think that it works really well. But I've been moving to NextJS. The problem is that for NextJS, that's what we're looking at. Ignore the minuses, but I had to write like something like 5,000, 7,000 lines of code, right? So Gatsby allows you to build things out of the box. And I think that that's the primary takeaway from the talk, is that like it lets you build things really quickly, really rapidly. And it lets you build them that look pretty good in the end, right? Like it's a useful SEO tool, and it's useful for CDN, and it's just very beneficial in a lot of regards. So in terms of simple sites, it definitely is my go-to. So, well, all right, y'all. I appreciate everyone hanging out today, seeing the talk. Once again, these links are you know, everything, and you can find me at Crutchcorn. Please feel free to DM and reach out. Happy to chat about anything, including Gatsby or beyond. So, thanks, y'all.